this episode, we're going to explore a topic that often feels invisible to beginners but has enormous privacy consequences: information architecture. Information architecture is the way data is organized, stored, connected, and made available across systems, teams, and processes. It includes choices about data models, identifiers, integrations, logging, analytics, and the overall design that determines where data flows and who can reach it. Privacy by design, PBD. Outcomes are the practical results you want, such as collecting less, limiting use, preventing surprise, controlling access, reducing retention, and enabling rights like access and deletion. For brand new learners, the key shift is realizing that privacy is not only something you add through policies and procedures, it is also something you bake into the structure of how data is arranged. If your architecture makes personal information easy to copy, hard to track, and impossible to delete, then no amount of policy language will fully fix the privacy reality. Evaluating architecture choices means spotting which design patterns support privacy and which patterns quietly create risk that will be expensive and painful later. A useful way to think about architecture is to picture it as the city layout for your data. Even if everyone intends to drive safely, a city with confusing roads, missing signs, and no sidewalks will produce accidents. In the same way, a data environment with unclear boundaries, mixed data types, and uncontrolled pathways will produce privacy issues, even if employees mean well. Architecture decisions determine whether personal information is stored in a few well-governed places or scattered across many systems in inconsistent formats. They determine whether data access can be limited to roles or whether access must be broad because systems cannot separate sensitive from non-sensitive information. They determine whether data sharing is deliberate through controlled interfaces or accidental through exports and shadow datasets. When you evaluate architecture, you are assessing whether the environment makes privacy-friendly behavior natural and scalable. This is what PBD looks like in structural form: a design that makes the safest option the easiest option. Start with a foundational architecture idea that matters for privacy: separation. Separation means designing systems so personal information is not unnecessarily mixed with other data or duplicated across environments. A common example is separating identifiers from behavioral or transactional data, so fewer systems need direct identification and the most sensitive parts can be protected more tightly. Separation can also mean storing sensitive categories of data in specialized services with stricter access rules rather than placing everything in one broad shared database. When separation is done well, it reduces the blast radius of mistakes and incidents, because fewer people and systems can reach the most sensitive data. It also makes monitoring and auditing easier because access to sensitive stores becomes more visible and meaningful. When separation is not done well, personal information spreads everywhere, and privacy becomes a cleanup effort rather than a built-in design. Evaluating architecture includes asking where separation exists, where it is missing, and whether separation is aligned with the sensitivity and purpose of the data. Another critical architecture choice is how identity is represented across systems, because identifiers are the glue that allows data to be linked, and linkage is a major driver of privacy impact. Some architectures rely on a single stable identifier used everywhere, which makes integration easy but can enable extensive profiling and makes it harder to limit use. Other architectures use different identifiers for different contexts, which can reduce linkage risk but requires careful mapping when legitimate needs exist. A privacy-friendly approach often tries to reduce unnecessary linkage by limiting where a universal identifier is used and by controlling mapping services tightly. This does not mean preventing all linkage, because organizations need to deliver services, handle support, and meet obligations, but it does mean being intentional about the scope of identity linkage. When evaluating architecture, you ask whether identifier design supports purpose limitation and minimization, or whether it encourages collecting and combining data simply because it is easy. Beginners should remember that privacy harm can arise from what can be inferred when data is linked, not only from what is stored in any single system. Data flow design is also an architecture choice, and it determines whether data sharing is controlled or chaotic. Controlled data flows usually rely on defined interfaces, clear ownership, and documented purposes, so data moves in predictable ways that can be audited. Chaotic flows often rely on ad hoc exports, manual transfers, and informal sharing between teams, which creates shadow copies and makes it hard to honor retention and deletion. A privacy-by-design architecture aims to reduce unnecessary copying by enabling teams to access what they need through controlled pathways rather than through duplication. It also aims to keep data flows aligned with purpose, so data moves only where it is needed for a defined reason. When you evaluate architecture, you look for where data is replicated, where it is transformed, and where it is stored in derived forms like logs or analytics tables. You also look for whether data flow governance exists in practice, meaning there are known owners and review steps when new flows are introduced. If governance is missing, data flows tend to grow without bounds. Life cycle outcomes depend heavily on whether the architecture supports retention and deletion, which is one of the most common pain points in privacy programs. Many systems are designed to store data indefinitely because deletion was never prioritized during design. Some architectures spread data across many services and backups without a clear record of where copies exist, making deletion slow and incomplete. A privacy-supportive architecture includes clear data ownership, retention metadata, and deletion mechanisms that can operate reliably over time. It also accounts for the reality of backups and logs, defining how long they persist and how access is restricted while they exist. When evaluating architecture, you ask whether the organization can locate all instances of a person's data and remove it when required, within a realistic timeframe. If the architecture cannot support that, then privacy promises about deletion and control may be hard to keep. That gap between promise and reality is a major source of trust erosion and compliance risk. Access control is another architecture-driven privacy outcome, because architecture determines whether fine-grained access is possible or whether access must be broad. In privacy by design, access is typically role-based and limited, meaning people receive only the access needed for their job. If systems cannot separate sensitive data from general data, teams may grant access to large data sets because they cannot grant access to only the relevant pieces. Architecture can also influence how access is audited, because centralized access management and consistent logging make it easier to detect misuse and to prove compliance. When access control is inconsistent across systems, privacy monitoring becomes weak because there is no unified view of who accessed what and why. Evaluating architecture means assessing whether access control is consistent, whether sensitive data can be isolated behind stronger controls, and whether access changes are tied to role changes reliably. The goal is to reduce the chance of internal misuse and accidental disclosure, which are common privacy threat paths. Transparency and user choice may sound like user experience topics, but architecture influences them too, because transparency depends on knowing what data is collected and how it is used. If data is scattered and poorly documented, the organization may not be able to describe its practices accurately to users. User choice, such as opting out of certain processing, depends on the system's ability to honor that choice across data flows and downstream uses. If architecture does not support propagating preferences and enforcing them, then choices become partial or inconsistent, which can feel deceptive. Architecture can also affect whether the organization can provide meaningful access reports to individuals, because access reports require knowing what data exists and where it lives. When you evaluate architecture for PBD, you ask whether the system can support the commitments made in notices and settings, not only whether it can store data efficiently. Beginners should understand that a system can be technically impressive and still be privacy fragile if it cannot support transparency and control in a reliable way. Another important architecture consideration is logging and observability, because logging can both help and hurt privacy. Logging helps security and reliability by showing what happened in a system, but logs can also capture personal information unintentionally, especially in error messages and debug traces. Architecture determines how logs are structured, how long they are retained, who can access them, and whether they are sanitized to remove unnecessary personal information. A privacy-by-design approach limits sensitive data in logs, restricts log access, and sets retention periods that match the operational need. It also ensures that monitoring can detect unusual access and misuse, which protects individuals by enabling faster response. When evaluating architecture, you ask whether logging practices create shadow copies of personal information that are hard to control and hard to delete. This is a common hidden risk because logs are everywhere, and teams often forget they contain personal data until an incident reveals it. Evaluation of architecture choices requires a balanced approach because architecture decisions involve trade-offs between performance, cost, usability, and privacy. A design that minimizes data collection might reduce certain product insights, but it can also reduce risk and increase user trust. A design that separates data stores might increase complexity, but it can also reduce blast radius and support stronger access control. A design that uses stable identifiers everywhere might simplify integration, but it can also amplify linkage risk and profiling potential. Privacy by design does not demand that every trade-off be solved in privacy's favor. It demands that trade-offs be intentional, documented, and aligned with obligations and expectations. The privacy professional helps stakeholders understand which architectural choices create long-term lock-in, because some design decisions become very expensive to change after launch. When privacy is considered early in architecture, the organization can choose patterns that support trust and compliance without endless retrofits. As we close, remember that Task 12 is about recognizing that privacy by design is not only a set of principles, but a set of structural choices. Information architecture determines where personal information lives, how it can be linked, how it can be accessed, how it can be shared, and how it can be deleted. Evaluating architecture for PBD outcomes means looking for separation of sensitive data, intentional identifier design, controlled data flows, and lifecycle support for retention and deletion. It also means assessing whether access control and logging practices reduce misuse and enable evidence, and whether the architecture supports transparency and user choices in a reliable way. When architecture supports privacy, procedures and controls become easier to implement and more likely to succeed under pressure. When architecture fights privacy, the program becomes a constant struggle against shadow copies, uncontrolled sharing, and promises that are hard to keep. Learning to evaluate architecture with this privacy lens helps you prevent risk at the root, where design decisions shape reality for years.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.